The desert in South Texas isn't empty. People think it is, but the silence here is only a disguise, a thin curtain stretched over something older and stranger than the sun-scorched sand. My name is Daniel Carter. I've worn a Border Patrol badge for years, but nothing in my training prepared me for the night. I lost my partner Roger Evans to something that should not exist. I remember the light that afternoon, the way you remember a wound. June 18th, the kind of day when the horizon wavers in heat, when distant mesquite trees look like ghosts trying to stand upright. Roger drove our white Tahoe along a gravel road where the Rio Grande's dry veins twist through cactus and stone. Tires hissed over dust. That was the only sound. No wind, no birds. Even the insects seemed to have signed a truce with the sun and gone silent. Roger was the kind of man who could walk into a black cave without a flashlight and come out smiling. A widower from Arizona, 20 years in the service, built of calm and stubborn humor. But that day he barely spoke, his eyes narrow as if the light itself carried a warning. We stopped to check a trail camera we'd strapped to a mesquite trunk 2 weeks earlier. It should have been pointing straight across the wash, but the mount hung crooked, metal bracket bent as if twisted by a wrench the size of a giant's hand. The plastic housing was cracked, its edges bruised with strange, oversized smears that caught the late sun like wet varnish. I leaned closer. If they were fingerprints, they belonged to no person I've ever met. The ridges were deep and long, the thumb pushed at a wrong angle, like a joint that had learned a different kind of anatomy. Roger let out a low whistle. "Takes some serious torque to do that," he said, but his voice had a rasp I'd never heard. The ground still held the memory of a rainstorm 3 days past, soft enough to record whatever walked there. What we found shut both of us up. Tracks humanoid, but stretched, warped. 15 inches heel to toe, almost 7 across. Each step pressed so deep, the sand glittered with compacted moisture. I measured 4 feet from print to print. That stride belonged to something at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and heavy enough to rattle the stones beneath it. We followed the trail until it vanished into a tangle of thorn and rock, the kind of terrain that swallows sign like a magician's scarf. Roger muttered something about black bears, but we both knew there hadn't been bears in this sector for decades. These prints were wrong in a way you can feel in your teeth. We logged photos, bagged the camera, and drove on. The sun slid toward evening, turning the desert copper and violet. Around 7, Roger braked hard and pointed toward a low ridge. I raised my binoculars and caught a flicker of movement, something dark slipping between the trees, quick and deliberate, gone before I could draw a breath. We jolted off the main track, the Tahoe rattling over stones, until the slope grew too steep to drive. We climbed the rest on foot, each thorn snagging at our sleeves like it wanted to pull us back. Halfway up, we found more prints, clustered in a shallow patch of dust between 2 boulders. They overlapped each other, a restless dance, all facing the road below, as though something had been watching us long before we noticed it. The wind failed. I felt the absence like a weight. Roger killed his flashlight for a second, and the world went ink black, except for the slow throb of my own pulse. When he clicked the beam back on, he aimed it upward, and that's when I smelled it, a stench that didn't belong to any living animal. I know. Wet fur baked in heat, rotting leaves soaked in iron, something older than language, sour and sweet enough to make my temples ache. We forced ourselves down the hill, senses wired tight. Near the base, a scrap of fabric caught the bean navy cloth, torn jagged, dotted with dark stains that glistened like varnish. Blood still tacky. Roger slid it into an evidence bag, his jaw clenched. The drive back to base stretched like a bad dream. More than once I thought I heard sticks snapping just beyond the headlights, but when I swept the desert with my torch, there was only brush and shadow. At headquarters, Sergeant Miller studied our photos, his brow carved with disbelief. The lab later confirmed what the nose already knew. Human blood, AB negative, a type so rare it felt like a signature. 2 nights later, we returned with plaster for casting prints, a metal detector, and enough water for a full day. The earth around that camera looked as if someone had sifted it with bare hands, shallow pits, clawed edges. Fresh tracks overlapped like restless thoughts. The detector screamed over one of the holes. We dug and lifted a bent military dog tag caked in soil. Asterisk, asterisk, Carlos Rodriguez, age 24 asterisk, asterisk, missing for 3 weeks from a hiking trail 14 miles away. Then came the skull. It lay 18 inches down, the left side fractured, as if something had struck it with impossible force. Deep grooves scored the bone, parallel and sharp, not the random work of scavengers. Blood stained the rocks nearby in wide arcs, as if violence had erupted upward, painting the desert in silence. The forensics team arrived at dusk, cataloging ribs, vertebrae, fragments of a life shredded. Even the veteran detective kept shaking his head. No tool, he knew, could leave marks like that. By the time we packed the last evidence bag, the stars were needles of ice across the sky. Roger drove us back without a word. I stared out at the empty dark, and for a heartbeat I could have sworn something immense moved between the mesquite, pacing us just beyond the reach of the headlights. The night after we pulled the last bone from the ground, the desert felt like it had changed its password. Same roads, same mile markers, but the spaces between mesquite and moonlight had learned anew trick how to look back. Roger kept both hands at 10 and 2, the way he did when something rattled him. The Tahoe's headlights coned the washboard road and brought up a storm of pale dust that hung behind, used like a tired ghost. He tried for normal talk about the mess hall coffee, the new radios that chirped like toy birds, but the words kept falling flat, like pebbles thrown into a dry riverbed. I watched the rear view, then the side window, as if the dark had a hinge I might catch opening. Halfway to the highway, the road lifted over a shallow rise. We crested it slow. That's when the world narrowed to a bright cone, and an outline stepped into it. Not leaping, not running just there, like it had been waiting inside the beam. Everything in me locked. Tall enough to blot the distant fence line, broad enough to make the mesquite seem like weeds around a telephone pole. The fur wasn't smooth. It clung and lifted in rough tides, shoulder to hip, as if wind lived under the skin. 2 long arms hung near the knees. The head looked undersized for the bulk, but the eyes, those were scaled wrong for any animal I know. They didn't flash like a deer's. They held the light and pressed it back, yellow-edged in a sickle of white. Roger didn't breathe. I heard only the cooling tick of the engine and something else, a sound so low it lived under hearing, more felt than heard, like the ground pulsed, like it missed a heartbeat. I raised my palm in a slow, open gesture I'd used 100 times with skittish dogs. The figure tilted its head the same fraction. The distance between us was 30 feet, then 29, when it shifted a single step forward, the way a person might close a gap to test a boundary. I could see individual strands of hair around the jaw, the dark seam where the lips met, a line of teeth the color of old piano keys. It exhaled. Heat and a dense stench pressed into the cabin. Wet hide, crushed leaves, a copper note that made my tongue tense. "Back it up," I said, voice barely more than breath. Roger eased us into reverse. The figure didn't follow. It held its place like a gate that would swing only when it wanted. For a moment that lasted far too long, we and the desert and that thing agreed on a strange truce no, movement bigger than an eyelid. Then we rolled past the rise and the figure vanished from the cone of light as if the land had folded around it. We turned and drove the long way to base. No radio chatter, just that hum in my bones fading slow. At headquarters, Sergeant Miller met us with two unfamiliar suits who introduced themselves only by last name. Their notepads looked new. Their eyes did not. They asked for everything twice: size, gait, smell, the quality of the light, the angle of its wrists, whether the hair on the forearms lay flat or lifted. One suit laid out a laminated book of animal eyes in night photos. None matched the way those pupils had seemed to hold our headlights like a grudge. They didn't tell us to shut up, but they didn't have to. The questions were a fence all by themselves. Roger kept his voice steady. I watched the tiny tremor in the corner of his mouth and thought of how he'd once walked into a bat cave with a grin and come out coated in dust like an old statue. Now his hands wouldn't leave each other alone. He laced and unlaced his fingers under the table as if counting sins. The next day I tried to sleep. I drove home with the sun still climbing and locked my door twice. The house sat on a gravel patch 6 miles from town. Low roof, chain-link fence leaning like it needed a cane. Noon heat should have sewn the world shut, but the shadows had teeth. I turned the TV on low for company and lay on the couch with a damp shirt over my eyes. That was when I noticed the silence had texture, the way a blank sheet sometimes shows the watermark if you tilt it just right. Something out there was listening back. I must have drifted. When I came up out of sleep, it was late afternoon, and the room felt crowded by nothing I could point to. The TV hissed with the quiet snow. I killed it, and the quiet grew louder. Outside, something touched the chain link, the faintest metal rattle, then another spaced too far apart to be wind. I slipped the shirt from my face and sat up, heart learning the drum pattern of a sprint. The window looked onto the side yard where mesquite pushed up through rocks. A shape moved between the leaves, low and slow, as if feeling along the fence for a seam. Not a coyote too heavy. Not a person the weight fell wrong, shoulders carrying more than hips. I stood barefoot on the cool tile, eased the blind with 2 fingers, and saw only leaf scrape and a breadth of shadow I could almost measure but not name. The rattle stopped. Silence stretched and bent. A jay screamed 3 streets over, then smothered itself mid-call. A second later, a high, thin whistle rose from beyond the far mesquite. Not a tune, more like feedback from a speaker turned on in an empty hall. The hairs on my arms lifted as if the room had grown a static field. A leftover from the world before language, my mind offered, unhelpful. I told myself it was a neighbor's swamp cooler dying, an odd breeze, a trick of heat. I told myself 10 reasonable lies and stood there believing none of them. When I finally remembered to breathe, the whistle folded into the sky. The ground under my heels quivered once, the way a bass note rolls through a floor, and the sense of a watcher eased back, not gone, just farther from the glass. By shift start, I was grateful for the office fluorescence. Roger showed up early, uniform ironed flat enough to slice. When I lifted it, the underside was perfectly clean, in a ring like it had been set there with deliberate care. I set it back and locked my door again. Sleep didn't come. I sat in the kitchen and listened to the refrigerator hum, and tried to decide which thing was worse, the idea that there was one of them or the idea that there were many. The coffee maker sputtered and clicked like a tiny engine dying. The clock on the wall ticked its cheap plastic heart. And underneath all of it, the earth held a low, patient note. A thought arrived and refused to leave, cold as a hand on the back of the neck, asterisk, asterisk, the ancestor that refused extinction, asterisk, asterisk, not an animal the desert forgot, but something the desert kept on purpose, the way a museum keeps its most dangerous exhibit behind unbreakable glass. Asterisk, asterisk, time's dirty little secret. Asterisk, asterisk. Before shift, Roger called. He never called before shift. You sleep? He asked. Not really. Yeah. He paused. You ever think about Oregon? He said out of nowhere, tall trees. Rain that sounds like pennies in a jar. My old man used to say some places swallow noise and some places make it. This one's a swallower. What are you thinking? I asked. He exhaled, a dry laugh stuck halfway to humor. I'm thinking there's a pattern. I'm thinking I don't know the pattern. And I hate that. We met at the lot and loaded gear for the Eastern Loop. Extra water, extra batteries, plaster and bags, and a dozen little vials as if evidence could defend us. The sun rose and flattened the world. By noon the light had a weight to it. By 2 my shirt clung to my spine. By 4 the sky turned a color I'd never seen blue, rinsed with bone. We found nothing worth a report, and that in itself began to feel like a report. At 9 that night, heading back on a narrow dirt road I could drive with my eyes closed, the headlights opened a tunnel, and the tunnel filled 1 step, 1 breath, 1 presence. This time it didn't stand. It walked toward us, slow as a verdict, shoulders rolling under the coat of hair. I felt the steering wheel tug as Roger's grip tightened. I touched his arm and whispered, "Easy." The figure paused, turned its head like a man in a courtroom, reviewing the gallery for faces. A strand of drool hung briefly, caught the light, and snapped. The road's dust haloed it like fog around a ship's prow. I could see the nails black, curved, long enough to write on bark. My chest discovered a new kind of shallow breathing. Roger reached for the radio. The thing's gaze tracked the micro-movement as if it had been waiting for it. The low sound came again, closer now, intimate as breath at your ear. I knew in that instant we were only visitors in a story that did not need us to continue. We backed away. It let us go. I didn't know yet that letting go can be a kind of map, a way of drawing a line around what it plans to keep. The desert has a way of teaching you patience, But after that second encounter, the lesson turned cruel. 3 days passed without a call-out. 3 sunsets of copper light and nervous radio silence, each night stretching longer than it had any right to. Roger kept working our patrols, but he'd started checking the rearview mirror the way some men check their pulse. I wasn't much better. Every time I stepped outside after dark, the ground seemed to carry a hidden vibration, soft, steady, like a warning only my bones could hear. On the 4th day, dispatch sent us south, toward a scatter of limestone outcrops the old maps called Devil's Hollow. The air carried that baked metal smell you only get before a desert storm, though the sky stayed glass clear. Roger drove without music, one hand always near the radio, the other locked on the wheel. We parked where the track ended and hiked the last mile along a dry arroyo. The silence there was the kind that folds around you like cloth. Even our boots sounded muffled, as if the sand wanted to keep our footsteps for itself. Halfway in, we found signs that made my stomach tighten. Mesquite branches snapped shoulder high, the wood still green and wet. Stones overturned, their undersides damp, as if someone had peeled them up moments before. And then prints. Not as clean as the ones we'd cast earlier, but unmistakable, enormous, human-shaped, the edges crumbling in the heat. They led uphill toward a ridge where the sun cut the horizon into blinding shards. We climbed, breathing hard in the thin heat. At the top we found a narrow shelf of rock, and there the smell hit sharp and sour, a mix of wet fur rust and something electric, as if lightning had scorched the air hours ago and the memory still lingered. Roger froze. "You feel that?" he whispered. A faint tremor ran through the stone beneath our boots, a single pulse that made the ridge feel alive. A sound followed, a long exhale that seemed to slide through the mesquite, too deliberate for wind. Then came the whistle, thin, almost metallic, rising and falling in a pattern that prickled the back of my neck. We scanned the slope, but nothing moved except the shimmer of heat. The sound faded, replaced by a stillness so dense it felt like a held breath. I tried to convince myself it was the echo of distant machinery, but every part of me knew better. Night dropped fast. The sky bled from orange to a bruised violet, and a moonless dark poured in behind it. We started down with headlamps slicing narrow cones through the brush. 10 minutes from the truck, a sudden rustle snapped the quiet. Roger spun, beam sweeping across the arroyo. In that circle of light stood a figure tall, motionless, a silhouette cut from the night itself. Its eyes caught the beam and glowed a dull amber, not reflecting, but burning from within. My chest locked. The thing tilted its head, slow and deliberate, and stepped forward. One stride, then another, each step heavy enough to thud through the sand. I lifted my sidearm, but my hands betrayed me, trembling like leaves in a storm. Roger reached for the radio. The creature stopped, raised one long arm, and let out a low sound that vibrated straight into the ribs, a deep, grinding note that felt older than speech. Before either of us could move, the beam caught a flash of movement to our left. Another shape, just as tall, slipped between the trees, then another behind it. 3 sets of eyes blinked in and out of the dark, forming a slow circling arc. The air thickened with that pungent smell, heavy and animal, but edged with something almost metallic. My skin felt charged, as though the night itself carried a current. Roger and I backed toward the truck, keeping our lights high. The figures held their distance, pacing us without a sound. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they melted into the brush. No crash of leaves, no snap of twigs, just gone, like the desert had taken them back. We reached the truck in a sprint, hearts hammering, the night around us alive with invisible movement. As Roger fumbled the keys, a deep thud echoed from the ridge 1, 2, 3, as if something massive had jumped from rock to rock. We slammed the doors and the engine roared to life. In the mirrors, nothing. Only darkness and the thin shine of stars. Back at base, the suits were waiting again, their questions sharper, their faces harder to read. They collected our clothes, our headlamps, even the dust on our boots. "Stay on routine patrols," one of them said, but his eyes kept drifting to the windows, as if he expected the glass to look back. I tried to sleep, but dreams came like ambushes. Roger's voice calling my name through black trees. The glow of eyes in a pattern I couldn't explain. A smell of rain on iron. I woke drenched, the house too quiet, the night pressing against the walls as though it remembered me. The next morning, Roger showed up pale but steady. "We need to check the South Ridge again," he said. Before they do, he didn't have to explain who they were. We both knew the suits weren't here to protect us. They were here to contain a story. We left before dawn, the sky just beginning to gray, the desert cold enough to bite. 20 miles out, we parked near a cluster of basalt boulders, their surfaces slick with dew that smelled faintly of copper. The plan was to hike the ridge, cast any new prints, and be back by noon. But halfway up the trail, the world shifted. First came the tremor settle, like a heartbeat underfoot. Then a sound, low and resonant, not quite a growl, not quite a drum. Roger stopped, scanning the slope. "You hear that?" He whispered, nodded. The noise grew louder, vibrating through the ground until small pebbles skittered across the path. Ahead, the brush parted with a slow, deliberate motion. Something immense moved there, just beyond the reach of dawn. Roger raised his rifle, but before he could aim, a figure burst from the mesquite towering, fur matted with dew, eyes burning with that same amber fire. It covered the distance between us in 3 strides, each one impossible in its speed and silence. Roger fired a warning shot. The blast cracked the cold air, echoing off the rocks. The creature didn't flinch. It lunged. The force of it hit like a landslide. Roger went down hard, the rifle skidding across the stones. I shouted, pulled my weapon, but the creature moved with a precision that defied everything I knew. It seized Roger by the vest and lifted him as if he weighed nothing, muscles rolling beneath its dark pelt. Roger kicked, shouted, but the sound was swallowed by a roar so deep it felt carved from the earth. I aimed, but its grip held Roger like a shield. For a heartbeat, its eyes met mine, intelligent, furious, almost curious. Then it pivoted, leaped across a gash in the rock, and disappeared into the canyon beyond. I scrambled after them, sliding on loose stone, branches tearing at my arms. I heard Roger's voice, one sharp cry, cut short. Then only the echo of that subterranean roar, fading into the endless maze of mesquite and stone. By the time I reached the canyon floor, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Only the faint, acrid scent of wet fur and iron, and a single deep print in the mud, fresh, enormous, already filling with cold water from the morning dew. I called for backup with a voice I barely recognized. Teams arrived within the hour. Local deputies, federal agents, search and rescue dogs. We combed the canyon until sunset. But Roger was gone. No trail, no body, no sign except those prints and the echo of something that should not be. When the last helicopter lifted off and the lights faded, I stood alone on the ridge where it began, the sky black and endless. The desert around me was silent, but not empty. Never empty. The days after Roger's disappearance blurred into a kind of waking fever. The desert sun kept rising. The dust kept breathing across the mesquite, but every hour carried the weight of something unfinished, like a question that refuses to stay quiet. Search teams scoured the canyons for nearly a week. Helicopters thumped the sky. Dogs swept dry arroyos and cactus fields until their paws bled. They found fragments only, a torn strap from Roger's vest snagged on barbed cholla, the shattered remains of his radio buried beneath gravel, a single brass casing from the round he fired that morning. Nothing else. No body, no trail, just the sense that the earth had folded over him and sealed the crease. Back at base, federal agents filled the halls like an unspoken storm. They wore no insignia, only plain clothes and eyes that scanned everything twice. They asked for every detail of that morning-hour route, the tremor in the ground, the smell, the roar. They photographed my boots, scraped dirt from my cuffs, swabbed the Tahoe for hair and fibers. Their questions circled like vultures. Did the creature leave marks on the rock? Did I see tools, weapons, technology? Did I hear mechanical sounds? I told them what I'd seen, and I watched disbelief flicker across their faces only to be replaced by something, colder concern, maybe, or recognition they refused to name. When they finally released me, night had swallowed the desert. I drove home along the empty highway, headlights carving narrow tunnels through the dark. The silence inside the cab felt alive. I kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see eyes those amber coals glowing in the dust behind me. At my house, the chain-link fence sagged as usual, but a stone the size of a fist sat centered on the back, steps, smooth, too smooth for desert rock. I knew it hadn't been there when I left. Sleep came in jagged fragments. Each time I closed my eyes, the roar returned, not a sound but a pressure, low and endless, vibrating behind the ribs. Sometimes I woke to the smell of wet fur and copper, sharp as lightning on dry soil. More than once I caught a shadow sliding across the yard just beyond the curtains. Neighbors said nothing. The world outside stayed polite, as if everyone had agreed not to notice. The official investigation thinned by the second week. The county filed Roger as missing, presumed deceased. The agency moved me to another sector, north of Laredo. Paperwork insisted on words like asterisk, closure, asterisk, and asterisk incident. Asterisk, but nothing closed. I drove those new patrol routes and felt the same hum under the tires, the same weight in the air. Sometimes a sudden silence would settle, and for a breath, I could smell the mesquite-scorched musk of that impossible presence. One night, months later, I took a solo shift through a stretch of empty chaparral. The moon laid a dull silver on the sand. Around midnight, the engine idled at a crossroads of dry washes, and I cut the lights, letting the desert breathe. That's when it came the sound that isn't quite a sound. A low, steady throb traveling through the ground, subtle enough to mistake for a heartbeat you don't own. The air tasted of iron and rainless storm. In the distance, between two sagging hills, a faint glow stirred. Not headlights, not fire, a soft, shifting luminescence, as if the night itself had peeled open. I stayed in the truck, hands fixed to the wheel, and listened until the glow faded and the vibration ebbed back into the earth. I didn't chase it. Not anymore. Some doors aren't meant to be opened twice. Roger remains a line in a report, a name that dispatch never calls. But I carry him with me, the sharp whistle he gave when we found those first prints, the calm he wore like armor, the last echo of his voice before the roar devoured it. People ask what happened out there. I tell them the truth, and they offer polite disbelief, the way you listen to a child talk about a nightmare. I don't argue. Let them think the desert is empty. Yet some nights when the wind dies and the horizon loses its edges, I feel it again, that low pulse, ancient and deliberate, as if the land remembers and refuses to forget. A reminder that somewhere beyond the mesquite and the dark, something older than our maps still walks, carrying the silence like a secret it will never share. I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there,